Hi, I'm making today's video to give you a quick review of the Sigma 14-24 F2.8 DG DN Art lens. I've had this lens for about 4 or 5 months and I want to give you basically a long-term review of it. I want to cover the build quality, how useful the focal range I find it to be, and also, of course, considering with the aperture that the lens provides. I want to talk, of course, about the image quality that this lens delivers. And finally, I want to talk a little bit about some of the quirks that I find in using this lens. So first off, let's talk about the construction of this lens. I think you may have already found other people have talked about this lens. It is of, in my opinion, very high grade of build. It has, compared to Sony, for example, the general Sony lens will be made completely of plastic on the outside, and inside, of course, there are some metals. With this lens, inside it's metal, but also on the outside you see the base part, this part, the focus ring, the focal, how to say, you know, the focal, the ring that allows you to change the focal length. This part is made of metal with a rubber ring on top. And also the focus ring here, it's also made of metal. The only part that on this lens that is plastic is actually right between the two rings. This section where there is a switch, I imagine they probably made it this way so that they can have this ridge section when there is no where there is no button. I guess that's the only reason I can come up, because otherwise why don't they make it a fully metallic construction on the outside? I don't know. Of course there's an integrated lens hood which is plastic, but it fits just well, and there is a this type of friction attached lens cap on the front, and this lens cap so far has not shown any sign of loosening. I hope this will continue. I hope it won't deteriorate over time. Of course, inside this lens cap there is this felt material that is providing the friction. And as usual, there is this bulbous front element which basically makes it impossible to attach traditional lens filters. And in the back we see, of course, good amount of rubber sealing, and there is a built-in rear filter holder, I guess it's called. That's I don't have rear filters and I don't really use filters, so that's fine. And one more thing, this lens, of course, when you zoom towards the wider end, the front elements will start to protrude more. So after shooting, after you take each shot, make sure that the lens is retracted to the 24mm setting. And of course, when you zoom from 24 to 14, not only the front element protrudes forward, where the rear element actually also protrudes rearward. So that's how the mechanism works. There's a focus hold button, or actually customizable button, and there's a very good manual focus, autofocus switch button. This button is very high quality. I would say it is absolutely better than the implementation on a lot of the Sony lenses that I've held. So that's construction. And then let's talk about a little bit, very briefly, about the focal range and the aperture. I find, at least in my use, I find the focal range to be quite useful. In my experience, perhaps I'm not a great photographer, and I do understand, I appreciate photographs when there is just a good amount of subject, not necessarily subject isolation in terms of blowing out the background and the foreground, but more of highlighting the subject. But actually I find it that when you are traveling, when you're walking around town, having a wider lens precisely help you to do that. Because when there are a lot of things that you don't want to include in your photo, with a wide-angle lens like this, you can get closer to the subject, and then you can use a wider focal length, and then you can eliminate a lot of things that you don't want to have included in the frame. So you see, of course, there's going to be a lot of perspective issues that can be a bit unusual for the human eyes, but I think that can be a plus. So I find it to be quite useful. I don't like to change lenses on the go, so I usually, when I just walk around, especially in cities, I prefer to just take this wide-angle lens. I find it to be very, very useful. Would it be more useful if it had a reach to 30 millimeters? Yeah, sure, absolutely. But at the same time, that would also make the lens bigger, so that's a consideration that you have to keep in mind. And then there is the issue of aperture. I find, at least in my copy, I haven't compared. This is the only copy I have, and this is the only copy that I've tried. I find this lens almost diffraction limited, in the sense that you don't necessarily improve sharpness when you stop down. So at least when I talk about focal image quality in the next section, I will discuss in detail. So what I mean by that. But just keep in mind that this means that when light becomes darker, when it becomes darker outside, right, will become less bright, you can just be comfortable not to stop down the lens much or not at all. So that is a plus to have the F2.8 aperture. But there are caveats that I have to mention in the last section of today's this video. So now let's move to the third section of this review, which is image quality. I find this lens to be rather even and rather sharp, and it has a good amount of contrast, very low aberrations and moderate distortions. When it comes to resolutions, I find in my copy, I find that it performs exceptionally well at 14 millimeters and at 24 millimeters. My guess is because these lens manufacturers, they need to publish their MTF, or as they call it, the charts, right? And the charts are measured usually with this type of lenses. They are measured at 14 and 24. So they made sure that the charts will look good at 14 and at 24. But perhaps they paid less attention to the middle of the zoom range, so that they can make sure that the lens is not as costly to manufacture, and that the size is not so big. So what happens is that from about 14 to 15, I would say it's almost exceptionally good, in the sense that from the very left edge to the very right edge, you will see almost no change in sharpness. It's almost all like entirely like the center. The extreme corners can be a little bit worse. Actually, the extreme corners are a little, just slightly worse. But still, it is a very good performance, and it compares very favorably to a lot of the prime lenses. And I'm talking about this wide open, right, F2.8. And when you stop it down, you don't really see much improvement. There is not much improvement. Maybe in the corners you see a little improvement, stopping down to 5.6, f5.6, but absolutely no improvement after 5.6. I don't think so. And by that point, the corners are still worse than the center, but the differences are so minor that perhaps it's difficult to tell. Right, so that's at 14, and then we will zoom to, that's at 14, right, and then we go to 24. At 24, I find that the center is very good. Actually, let me just be brief here. The 24 performs almost exactly like 14. The center to the edges, I almost just great all around, left to right, of course top down, but the corners are slightly worse. I think it's a 14 to 15 like this, and I think around 20 or 20 to 24 are like this. But in the middle, right around 17 is where it gets a little bit worse. You could see going past the 21 and 2021, zooming out to around 16, you could see that the circle of perfection, let's call it, the circle of perfection shrinks down a little bit, and then around 17 it gets perhaps the worst, and then it goes out again. So I think that has to do with the zoom mechanism. Perhaps in the middle it's somewhat compromised because a lot of elements inside are moving when you zoom, right? So I think perhaps the design is such that the extremities of the focal range are more favored, are prioritized over the center. So around 17, 18 is where it's not as good. And what is not as good? What does that mean? Well, what it means is that I would say on the left side and on the right side there's about 1/6 to 1/8 of the frame that is worse. And that is what I'm talking about, the center of the left and right edges. But when we talk about the top and bottom, I would say from top to bottom edge, it's perhaps almost perfect. And obviously, if the edges are not as good, the corners are going to be slightly worse. But the good news here is that it's still decent. It still compares quite favorably to a lot of the prime lenses. I don't necessarily have a lot of prime lenses, actually I don't, but just from the online pictures that I have seen, the test shots that people have made, or for example the Batis 18, I think the Luxia 21, and even the Sony 20, this lens I think compares favorably. And of course, when I say that it is a little bit worse, around 17, 18, I'm talking about wide open. When you stop it down, this time I think it can stop down beyond 5.6. If you stop down to f8, it reaches very good level of performance. I would say left to right, almost even. The center slightly better maybe, but it's very good. But the corners obviously still a little bad. But then again, you never know whether this is really about the lens because it is the corner, or because it's the perspective, because the lens is indeed stretching some things. So I guess maybe that is it. So overall, I would say resolution-wise, it is it's very, very good. I was very pleasantly surprised, especially considering the price of this lens, the build quality that it has, and it's a wonderful lens, and things actually gets better from here, right? When we talk about the contrast, I just find the contrast to be extremely high, and there's very little bits of ghosting, even when you have the sun in the frame. Very little bits of ghosting and veiling, that kind of issues, and it has great control of chromatic aberrations. There is, I think, no, even in the most adverse scenarios, meaning you, for example, there's water, right? There's water, moving water, and you're shooting against the sun. The water still does not show any longitudinal chromatic aberration. It's still very clean, right? So I think that means that it has very good control of longitudinal chromatic aberration. And also, there is virtually no lateral chromatic aberration. Even maybe when you shoot against the sun, of some tree branches, bold branches, you could see in the corners just that a little bit of bright edges, doesn't necessarily have any color to it, just a little bit brighter. I think that could be some sort of chromatic aberration, but there is no real fringing, right, color fringing type of lateral chromatic aberration. So I think that also explains why the lens had such good resolution, because it has very low aberration. And I think this also explains why for a lot of scenarios it is so-called diffraction limited, meaning that when you stop down the lens, actually you get less light in, and thereby you decrease the resolution of the image. So that, I think, is with the contrast and the aberrations. One downside I find of this lens is, of course, the sandstars. And the sandstars, I really like sandstars, and I think this is a product of this lens's 11-bladed aperture and rounded. The 11-bladed and rounded aperture. This basically means that Sigma made sure that it is very, very difficult to produce any sandstar. Especially if there is no object in the way of the sun, and the sun needs to be really a bright sun, not the sun behind a cloud kind of light, right? Only the sun, but there needs to be some object that is covering half of it. In that scenario, you could get some sandstars, but only at f11. F9 it starts to show a little bit. From f11 you can see it. But even then, remember it's 11-bladed aperture and rounded, so what you get is a 22-bladed sandstar that is actually a little bit radiating, right? The good sandstar that you want to have is one where the center is a little bit wider, and as it goes out, the blade thins. This is actually a little bit different. This in the center of the sandstar, it's a little bit small, and then it actually goes out a little bit. This, of course, does not make for very beautiful sandstars. So that's the only problem or downside to this lens in terms of image quality. However, I must say that there is no alternative that is better in this regard. I think Sony's G Master lens being almost 3 times the price. I think it also has 11 bladed aperture. Oh, is it 9? I don't quite know. I think it's 11 bladed as well. So can't be better anyways. Also rounded. If you really want to have good Sunstar, you should have 10 bladed straight cut aperture blades, or maybe 12 blade straight cut apertures. And in fact, if I were designing this lens, I would have recommended Sigma to consider putting in a 12 bladed straight cut aperture, because the idea of having 11 bladed rounded aperture is to have a smooth out of focus rendering. But at this focal range, you're not going to get much out of focus rendering, the so-called bokeh. You're not really going to get much of it. And even though I think the rendering is very, very smooth on this lens, in fact, you still see too much, and it's distracting. In fact, I much prefer to make sure that I shoot it in such a way that at least most of the things in the frame is in focus, is sharp. Because a lot of things that are kind of blurred out, but not really, I don't find that to be a good look. I find that to be, you have a good lens, but it looks as if you have a bad lens that is decentered or somewhat. So that's image quality. Now the last part, I think also a very important part, and it's something that I didn't realize before, is that and this is about using this lens, right? I just find that with Sony, I don't know if this really applies to other cameras, but with Sony, what you need to keep in mind is that with a ultra wide angle lens, especially as you go beyond 24 millimeters, what you have to really be very careful about is this camera movement, right? The tilts, the yaws of when you take pictures, and you probably want to turn off the image stabilization. I find with a little bit of side-by-side handheld side-by-side testing, and at very high shutter speeds, and not necessarily very high, but I'm talking about 1/300 beyond that. You want to perhaps turn off the image stabilization, because when the stabilization tries to work, what it does is that it tries to move the sensor to translate the sensor, right? The sensor will always be at the focal plane. It will the sensor plane, all right? The sensor plane, not the focal plane, will always stay at the sensor plane, because when you mount the lens on the camera, there's this flange distance, right? This must be a set value, so the sensor will always be at this plane. So the only way that in-body image stabilization works is to translate the sensor along the X and Y axis. So if you have a movement in your camera that is only along the X and Y axis, then you can have good stabilization. But when you start to introduce tilts and yaws, what you will experience is that the camera will still translate the sensor in order to compensate for the yaw and tilt movement, and as a result, what you get is that the center will be slightly improved, but the corners will be destroyed. Right? much more than your original hand movement. And this is very evident the wider you go. So if you have a telephoto lens, absolutely keep the stabilization on, because the angle of view of a telephoto lens is very, very narrow. So compensating for the center, for yaw and tilt is not that different than compensating for the corners for the same type of movement. So that's the difference. When you have a ultra wide angle lens, the angle of view is very high. So the cosine basically is the cosine of this, right? Between the cosine of the field of view, angle of view, half of the angle of view, basically is going to be higher, right? So this means that compensating for the center means actually worsening the corners. So you probably want to turn the stabilization off. That's one thing. And another thing is that I find it quite useful to use manual focus. Of course, autofocus on this lens it's fine. It works just fine. But I find that to compose the entire frame, to make sure that everything that you want to be in focus is in focus for a landscape shot, that kind of shot where you want, especially the kind of shot when you want perhaps everything to be in focus, then you may want to try manual focus. Alright, so this is my user review of the Sigma 14-24 F2.8 DG DN Art lens, and I've been having this lens for a lot of time, for several months, and I find it to be an exceptional lens. I will certainly recommend it, and of course, if you like it, like this review, give me a sub, and you can also check out my website where I have comparisons of this lens and some other lenses as well. So thanks for watching, and have a great day. Oh, by the way, let me just also emphasize that because I don't have a microphone stand, so, and I'm not really a YouTuber, so I'm not I'm just recording this video using in-camera microphones, so there could be some echoes. I know that the room is not really treated at all. It's a little bit empty, so I apologize for that as well. Thanks, and have a good one.